wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, he from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed, rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, he from the dawn of creation. Wonderful.
Opens up, it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Now I'm just going to stop there for a moment and let's talk about this idea of testing. What does it mean? What is a test? Okay, to see if one's up for the job. Any other thoughts or ideas? Okay, it's a measurement. It's a tool to measure. Who's benefited from a test? At least if it's administered properly. Who benefits from it? In this case, Abraham would. Anytime, if you look at it from a scholastic standpoint, tests should be designed and purposed to help the students, to further the students, to make them aware, for instance, of the things that they grasp and understand, and aware of the things that they don't yet grasp and understand, so that they can do what? Do the remedial work that they need to do to improve those areas that they don't grasp yet, and so that they can succeed. That's not how testing is run most of the time. And so when we read the word test, we think that that's some kind of, okay, barrier's a good word. Students generally are afraid of tests. They don't see test as being something that is to benefit them. They see test as being something to do what? Yeah, make them fail. That's a good way to put it. I was going to say punish them, but make them fail is even better. That is not what's intended, and that is not how this word is being used here. God doesn't tempt anyone to evil, right? James makes that clear in the book of James. This isn't a test in the sense that we might sometimes use test interchangeably with the word temptation. We face a temptation and we say, oh, we test. But in function, it serves the same purpose. In what way does a temptation test us? Well, it tells me how much self-control I have. It tells me whether I've overcome some improper desire or whatever thing like that. So there is a test role that is in temptations, but that's not the kind of test that's going on here. Now, the next thing I want to say is this: what does God not know? He knows everything. So this test was in.
Testing from God for one of us, but it's a little different human to human.
Well, it shouldn't be, but you're right, sometimes it is.
You're the teacher and I'm the student. You give me a test to see how well you've done as far as teaching me. God already knows what's going to happen, but the teacher don't know.
Right.
But that test is going to help me.
Right.
A little different there.
I understand what you're saying. And I do agree that there is a role for teachers as well. I think that we've taken that a little bit too far personally in my personal theory about education. I'm not an education scholar, but I do have personal beliefs about education theory, and I do read and study that stuff. So, but anyway, I think we've taken that too far. I don't necessarily believe that because a student doesn't do well on a test, that means the teacher didn't do their job. I think that it might become clearer that there was an issue with the teaching if every student fails the test. That may indicate that there was a teaching problem. And so in that sense, yes, it can help both sides of the spectrum, but that's kind of where I'm going, is God doesn't have anything to learn from this. So this isn't for God's benefit. And I'm not even certain that it's exclusively for Abraham's benefit, although I think Abraham can benefit from it. But we'll talk about that a little bit more, hopefully, as we develop the class. But there is a whole different audience that benefits and learns from the test that is set up here, and a whole different purpose of this test than just to help Abraham. As a teacher, I would design tests to help my students, and that's probably as far as that would go. God is much more broad in his purposes of this test.
Going back to human to human, you're testing them on knowledge that they have learned from you, but it's almost like putting faith in that. Well, that student, if you go back to the word faith being, the substance of things hoped for, he didn't hope in the right sense in the word as far as faith. He wouldn't hope it. He had a hope, but he hoped it would get along and go back. He didn't go home and do his study, and he didn't have it. His hope wasn't in the depth of
Yeah. Did God know what Abraham would do?
He didn't have it sure he's going to get it right.
Right. But did God know what Abraham was going to do? Yeah, God already knew what was going to happen. This wasn't educational to God at all. There's a different audience, and that's the main point that I want us to understand. And understand that this is not some kind of power exercise on the part of God, or even, I'm just going to make life difficult for Abraham. That's not what's going on here. God knows Abraham. He knows what Abraham's going to do. just like he knew what Job would do. Y'all remember the exchange in the beginning of the book of Job, when God speaks to the devil, says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm roaming on the earth, looking for basically men to deceive." He says, "Well, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him." He says, "Well, of course. You've protected him. You don't let anything happen bad to him. You let something bad happen to him, he'll certainly curse you." God says, "Do what you want to." God knew exactly what Job was going to do. That wasn't for the benefit of God either. That was for the benefit primarily of Job and for all of us, inasmuch as the events are recorded for us for our learning, so that we can learn those same lessons that Job was able to learn from that experience. It's a similar thing here. God knows exactly how Abraham's going to react. He knows exactly what's going to happen here. It's not a test in the sense that it's going to uncover something to God. It's a test in the sense that it's going to display the measure of faith that Abraham has developed. He said, "Take now your son." All right, I'm going to stop for a minute. What was chapter 21 about? We just studied it last week. Chapter 21's about, that's chapter 20. It's before Ishmael, it's about the birth of Isaac. Chapter 21, the opening of chapter 21 is the birth of Isaac. How old was Abraham? 100 years old. How old was Sarah? 90 years old. How long had they been waiting for this child? A long time. It had been decades since the child had been promised. The child is finally born. They have a child. The child is growing up. God says, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." How long had Abraham been waiting for this child? Had they given up on receiving this child? By the way, that was a test of their faith as well. It's not called that necessarily in those words in the Bible, but the delay in God fulfilling that promise tested their faith. A test, by the way, that at least on certain days they didn't do too well with. How hard, after you've waited decades for a promise to be fulfilled, and you get your child, and you've been promised, what about this child? It's not just I'm giving you a son, but what? Okay, I'm giving you the son. This son's going to be a great nation, and the entire world's going to be blessed through this son. And while the son is yet a lad, God speaks to him one day and says, "Hey, take that son that you love, go up on the mountain Moriah, and offer that son as a burnt offering." First off, just on the surface, that's difficult, right? What would be your general feeling if someone in our community slaughtered and burnt their child? Would we be disgusted? Yes. Would we be angry? This is not what you would think of as being normal behavior, right? Now, on a deeper level, if Isaac is just a lad, what does he not have? He doesn't have a wife and children. How's he going to be a great nation? God made a promise. I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham even said, well, I got this Ishmael already. But no. That's not the son that I promised you. I promised you a son. That son's going to come through Sarah, your wife. And that's the son of promise. And then a year before Isaac is born, he shows up and says, okay, this time next year, you're going to get the son I promised you. And the son is born. And now when he's just yet a lad, he's told to sacrifice that son. Before that son has matured, before that son has taken a wife, before that son has born any children. What happens when your only son dies as a lad without bearing any children? You don't have any offspring. And yet God had told him, your offspring are going to be so great, you could just as easily number the stars or the pieces of dust on the ground as number your offspring. This has got to be terribly confusing. Does it not? Does it not sound like that this is an instruction, a command even, to do something that is to guarantee that the promise which was made cannot be fulfilled? Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering. He arose and went to the place of which God had told him. That is walking by faith. Because listen, there's nothing about this that makes sense. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance, and Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder. We will worship and return to you. Apparently, by the way, Abraham was a southerner from the U.S. because he uses the word yonder. Go over yonder. We'll worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. That just simply means that he gave it to Isaac to carry. He took it in his hand the fire and the knife, and so the 2 of them walked together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the offering? What a question. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. The 2 of them walked on together. They came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar atop the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Again, I would not hesitate from saying that God already knew what Abraham would do. But the text does say that he said, for now I know. Do our actions mean anything? Okay, there's one big lesson in this. That our actions do, in fact, mean something. Does faith always make sense? For the benefit of those that are watching online, someone suggested that if it did, it wouldn't be faith. It's a good observation. And the answer is no, it doesn't always make sense, because we don't always see everything, and we certainly don't know everything. We don't have flawless reasoning either. Sometimes our reasoning can be flawed. We can have information, and we can have circumstances, and we can have or draw a conclusion, and it can be a problem in the information that gives us a bad conclusion, or it can be a problem in my reasoning that gives me a bad conclusion. But when it comes to these kinds of matters, it may be all those above. I may lack information because I don't have the ability to know it. I may lack information because I've ignored it. Just because I lack all the information, does that mean that my conclusion that it's a foolish thing to do is correct? And the answer is no. Listen, this happens to us in life, in everyday life. Usually it's when we're young. Our parents ask us to do something. Our grandparents ask us to do something. It doesn't make any sense to us. It seems like it's the wrong thing to do. We want to do something different. We don't understand why. But later in life, we look back on it and say, that's why they wanted me to do that. What's changed? I'll tell you what's changed: the information I have. I have more information now. I see things that I didn't see when I was young. When we're rash in our decision making, mistakes can be made. There's just all sorts of levels in this. So when we read in this book and God says, don't do this, and I'll give you a great example. Go back to Genesis chapter 3. Do not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden. Ultimately, how did Satan attack that commandment? Okay, he did, but that actually didn't work very well. What was the one that really worked? When Eve saw that the fruit was a delight to the eyes, that it was good for food, and that it was desirable to make one wise, she ate. What did she not see? The consequences, the spiritual consequences, the separation from God, the losing access to the tree of life. She didn't see that part of it. She thought it would be something good. And God was pretty clear. You can eat anything you want to, except don't eat that. And because she failed to see all of the consequences, she thought that that was a bad commandment and decided that it didn't need to be followed. That's exactly what could go on any day of any of our lives when we face a challenge with something that we see and with the set of information that we have and the circumstances that we're in, and we say to ourselves, well, I know that it says this, but why? But it looks good, but it'll make me wise, but it'll be good for me, but certainly God understands. There's a lot of people that do foolish things who understand what they're doing is wrong because they think for whatever reason for them at that time in those circumstances, that prohibition doesn't apply. There's good reason to do something different. Abraham could have simply said, well, look, God promised me that he's going to be a great nation. If I kill him, then so he can't seriously really want me to kill him, so I'm just not going to do it. And he would be justifying it based upon what? What God said earlier. But we're going to find out something about Abraham's thinking that's not covered in this text in just a moment. That'll give us some insight into the right way for us to think about these things. Let's go over first to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Just a couple of verses there make reference to this situation. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, there's our word again, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So the Hebrew writer even uses the quote from God. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And so what we find out about Abraham is that Abraham says, you know what? God said this and he said this. And I don't get to use God's commandments against one another. I need to follow them both, and God will do whatever God has to do in order to fulfill his promise. God promised that my offspring would be named through Isaac. And God told me to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And if God has to raise Isaac from the dead in order to fulfill his promise to me that through Isaac my offspring would be named, then that's what God will do. It's not my job to correct God. And it says in this text, figuratively speaking, that's exactly what happened. He did receive him back. And the way that happened was that God prevented Abraham from carrying it out. But what we learned here very clearly is that it was Abraham's intent. And the way we learn that is it says right here, he considered that God, and I said, where is it at? Was in verse 17, was in the act of offering up his only son. He was committed to doing it. He was in the middle of doing it. He was prevented from doing it. And that was a figurative receiving back of Isaac. Now, I want to flip over to the book of James for just a moment. Look in chapter 2 of the book of James with me, verses 21 through 24. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. And so we learned in all of this that faith would not be Abraham simply believing something and not doing it. But faith was him hearing the command of God and actively carrying it out. It doesn't matter that in this case, God prevented him from actually putting the knife into his son. I heard one preacher one time preach that the angel grabbed his hand and kept him from plunging the knife. That's not what the text says. Nice drama, but it's not what the text says. What the text says is that he spoke to him and said, stop. Now I know. We see in these events what true faith in God really looks like. And that means that even when I find it distasteful and I don't see any way around concluding that this would be something that would be distasteful to Abraham. If it's a command of God, if I have faith, I do it. Doesn't matter how hard it is. If it's a command of God, if I have faith, I do it. Doesn't matter how far I have to go or how much work I have to do. He had to split the wood. He had to load up the donkey. He had to walk for 3 days. He had to build an altar. He didn't say, that's too much to ask. That's a lot of work. Kind of like Noah. Noah didn't say, well, God, thank you for letting me know about the rain and all, but can't you just give me a boat? I mean, you spoke the world into existence. Can't you just speak a boat? By the way, could God have spoken a boat into existence? Yes. Why did he have him build it? It was a test. Why does he have people be baptized? Why does he want us to confess with our mouth? Why does he ask us to go into the world and to share our faith? You think he's watching to see what we're doing? You think he cares? Listen, is there any indication here that God was not paying attention to whether or not Abraham carried out this? No, and in fact, there's every indication that God was watching very closely. Knew every moment what Abraham was doing. Knew exactly when to stop him. Because he was intimately engaged. Don't think that he's not intimately engaged with us. He's watching. He knows. He knows when I convince myself, well, that can't be what God meant. I know that's what it says, but that can't be what it meant. He knows. When I say, well, I know I'm not supposed to, but man, that looks good. He's watching. It was accounted unto him for righteousness. What we just read, right? Reckoned. I love that word that's used in the King James Version. It was reckoned unto him for righteousness. That's an accounting term. God gave him credit for righteousness. Do you think that righteousness is credited to us any other way than acting in faith? That's the whole point that James is making. That it was the action that completed his faith. Faith was incomplete without him doing. And that was reckoned to him as righteousness. I don't know exactly what was in Abraham's mind because the text doesn't tell me exactly what was in Abraham's mind. But the Hebrew writer by inspiration tells me that Abraham believed that God would do whatever needed to be done to fulfill his promise. Do I believe God's promises that much? That even if by sight it looks like it's not possible now for the promise of God to be fulfilled, do I believe that God will do whatever is necessary to fulfill the promise that he made? Because that's what Abraham believed. Had Abraham ever seen anyone raised from the dead? Nope. Nobody had seen a 90-year-old woman have a child either. Well, maybe they had a long time ago, but she was beyond childbearing years. The text is clear about that. So why would he even imagine that God would raise him from the dead? Because God had promised through Isaac, your descendants will be named. And he believed that God would fulfill his promise. Even if he slaughtered Isaac and burned him on the altar, he believed that there would be descendants from Isaac and that God would do whatever was necessary to make that possible. That's believing the promises of God. This becomes extremely important in connection with what we did study in chapter 20 and 21, which is the true heirs of Abraham are those that have Abraham's faith. It's not the people who are physically descendant of Abraham that are the heirs of the promise. It's the people who have Abraham's faith who are the heirs of the promise. We studied that in quite a lot of detail, right? It gets confusing in there, but the allegory for what is that, Galatians 4? That's what it's talking about. The two covenants. It wasn't the physiological descendants of Abraham that was, in fact, the recipients of heirship to the promise. It was those who have the faith of Abraham. This is what the faith of Abraham looks like. And so we see in this a test for ourselves. Does my faith look like that? Do I make decisions that way? Well, I don't know how this is going to work out, but God said it would, so I believe God. We have an example of that in the Apostle Paul, don't we? Acts 27, I love teaching Acts 27. On the ship, the Adramyttian ship, big storm. Paul the whole time's telling his guys, we don't want to go. This is a bad time of the year to sail. Don't get on the boat. They get on the boat anyway. Terrible storm arises. 2 weeks into the storm, they're all throwing everything overboard, and they are certain that they are going to die. And God says, just stay on the boat. You'll be fine. And Paul makes that speech, and he says what? I believe God that it will turn out exactly as he has said. Paul didn't believe that when he looked at the situation with his eyes. Paul believed all along that they were in danger when he looked at the situation with his eyes. When God said, if you stay on the boat, you'll live, Paul said, I'm going to stay on the boat. That's what it means to walk by faith and not by sight. We see it in Abraham. We see it in Paul. We see it in Jesus. When we're told that he could have called 12 legions of angels out of heaven to deliver him from the cross, why didn't he do it? Because he came to do the Father's will. What did God do? Raised him from the dead. Abraham considered that God would raise Isaac from the dead if that's what was necessary to fulfill the promise. Do we have that kind of faith? Because that's what this is teaching us. This is what faith in God looks like. It means that I believe God even when things don't turn out the way that I want them to. When God says that he hears the prayers of the righteous and he answers, and I pray and ask for something and it doesn't turn out the way I want it to turn out, am I willing to say, so be it. It's the way God would have it. Am I willing to do that? Because that's the kind of faith that's being described here. That says, you know what? I don't know everything, and I don't have all the answers, but I serve a God who cares, and a God who blesses, and a God who does what's in my best interest and what's necessary for his will to be carried out. So whatever that is, I'll accept it. That's what I see in Abraham here. Abraham saying, look, I don't understand this, but I will accept what God has asked of me. Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went, took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And I'm one of the ones who thinks that verse 13 is foreshadowing the Christ, who, by the way, was descendant of Isaac and was, in fact, the lamb. Yep. Yep. That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Isaac was received back on the third day. Christ was received back on the third day. There's lots of parallelism in this and reasons to draw those conclusions that this is a foreshadowing. But listen, this wasn't just a test for Abraham. This was a test for me, and it was a test for you, and it was a test for all of us. It is teaching us. It is teaching us what true faith really looks like. And the question is, do we pass the test? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Got to stop tonight. We'll pick up here next time, wherever that is, middle of the chapter, and move on. But this is just rich material that will go a long way to equip us to overcome the temptations that we face in life.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun